The phone rang at 11:14 on a Tuesday night in March 2024. And when Detective Sergeant Karen Alves picked it up, the voice on the other end was barely above a whisper. "I've been carrying this for 38 years, the caller said. "I need you to know what happened to Rosalie Fitch." Alves had been with the Harwick County Sheriff's Office for 19 years. She had worked cold cases for the last 6 of them. She had learned, in that time, the difference between the calls that go nowhere and the calls that change everything. She reached for her notepad. The line was quiet for a long moment. Then, the caller began to speak. "This is not a story about a murder that went unsolved because there were no answers. This is a story about a murder that went unsolved because the people who had the answers chose, deliberately, and for 38 years, to keep them. And it would take one person, in the last season of their life, deciding that silence was no longer something they could live with, to finally bring Rosalie Fitch home." But before we get to that phone call, we have to go back to August 1986, because to understand what was protected for 38 years, you first have to understand what was lost. Harwick County, Virginia, in the summer of 1986, was tobacco country. Broad, flat fields running out to tree lines in every direction. The air thick with heat, and the particular sweet rot smell of curing barns at the end of a long season. The county seat was a town called Pemberton, population just under 4,000, with a main street that still had a 5 and dime and a pharmacy with a soda counter, and a hardware store whose owner, a man named Gus Whitaker, had been there so long he knew which families bought on credit and which ones paid cash and the difference it said about them. Rosalie Fitch was 29 years old that August. She had grown up in Harwick County, the second of 4 children born to a tobacco farming family on the Eastern Ridge. She had married young, a man named Carl Fitch, who worked the county road crew. And when that marriage ended quietly in 1982, she had moved back to Pemberton and made a life on her own terms, which was not a small thing to do in a county that noticed everything. She worked the front desk at the county assessor's office 5 days a week. She sang in the choir at First Methodist. She drove a tan 1981 Buick Skylark she had bought used and maintained herself with a stubbornness that her younger sister Loretta still mentions when she talks about who Rosalie was. She was saving money. She had been accepted to a nursing program at the community college in Staunton, and she planned to start in January. She had told Loretta in a letter, written, stamped, sent the week before she died, that she felt like her life was finally pointed in the right direction, like things were finally going to open up. On the evening of August 21st, 1986, Rosalie Fitch attended the choir rehearsal at First Methodist, the same as she did every Thursday. The rehearsal ended at 8:30. 3 members of the choir walked to their cars together and watched Rosalie pull out of the lot in the tan Skylark and head south toward the county road. They waved. She waved back. She never made it home. Her absence was noticed by 8 o'clock the following morning, when she failed to appear at the assessor's office, and the woman she carpooled with could not reach her. Loretta Fitch, living 40 minutes away in Waynesboro, received a call from a neighbor by 10. By noon, the Pemberton Police Department had been notified, and a patrol officer had gone to Rosalie's rented house on Cedar Mill Road, finding the door unlocked, a window fan still running, an untouched pot of coffee that had burned down to nothing on the stove. The tan Skylark was found at 2:15 that afternoon, a quarter-mile down a dirt access road that ran between a soybean field and a tree line at the edge of the Holt property, a 200-acre tobacco farm owned by the Holt family since the 1940s. The car was off the road, partially hidden by brush, as though it had been driven there deliberately rather than pulled over. The driver's side door was open. The keys were in the ignition. There was blood on the driver's seat. The investigation that followed was led by Harwick County Sheriff's Deputy Clint Morrow, 44 years old, 20 years in the department. He processed the scene, documented the evidence, requested state police assistance. The blood was typed O positive, matching Rosalie's records. There were tire tracks from a second vehicle near the Skylark, wide tread, likely a pickup truck. There was a partial boot print in the soft mud at the edge of the access road. Rosalie's body was found 3 days later by a deer hunter in the tree line on the northern edge of the Holt property, approximately 6/10 of a mile from where the Skylark had been left. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. The medical examiner estimated she had been killed within hours of leaving the choir rehearsal. The access road sat on property belonging to the Holt family. The investigation, almost immediately, looked in that direction. The Holts had been in Harwick County for 4 generations. In 1986, the farm was run by 2 brothers, Warren Holt, 51, and his younger brother Dennis, 43. Both unmarried. Both known quantities in Pemberton, Warren the quieter of the 2. A deacon at the Baptist Church on Route 11, Dennis more visible. A man who drank at the Elks Lodge on Friday nights, and whose name had come up in 2 separate domestic disputes in the early 1980s, neither of which resulted in charges. A woman who had briefly dated Dennis Holt in 1984 had mentioned to a friend on record years later that he had a temper that arrived without warning and departed the same way. Deputy Morrow interviewed both brothers within the first 48 hours. Warren said he had been home that Thursday evening, alone, and had gone to bed early. Dennis said he had been at the Elks Lodge until closing time, an alibi that the bartender and 2 regulars confirmed without hesitation. The confirmed alibi stopped the investigation in its tracks. Over the following months, Morrow pursued other leads: a man Rosalie had dated briefly, a dispute over a property assessment at her office, the possibility of a stranger passing through. None of it built toward anything. The state police concluded their assistance by the end of September. The case remained open, but unpursued. By the spring of 1987, Harwick County had moved on in the way that communities move on. Not forgetting, exactly, but filing the grief away in a place where daily life didn't have to keep encountering it. Loretta Fitch could not file it away. She called the sheriff's office every 3 months for the first 4 years. She wrote letters to the state attorney general in 1989 and again in 1993. She drove back to Pemberton every August 21st, the anniversary, and placed flowers at the edge of the access road where the Skylark had been found. She had a photograph of Rosalie, taken at the choir's Christmas concert in 1985, Rosalie in a red dress, laughing at something just off frame that she kept on the mantel above her fireplace. She looked at it every morning. "I always believed someone in that county knew," she said, years later. "I always believed they knew, and they just decided she wasn't worth the trouble." The years between 1987 and 2024 did what 38 years do to a case that nobody is actively working. Clint Morrow retired from the department in 2001 and died of a heart attack in 2009. The Holt brothers continued farming. Warren Holt had a mild stroke in 2014 and moved to an assisted living facility in Roanoke. Dennis Holt, now in his late 70s, remained on the property with a hired hand and a pickup truck that had been replaced many times over. The Pemberton 5 and Dime closed in 1997. The pharmacy soda counter was gone by 2003. The assessor's office where Rosalie had worked moved to a new building in 2011. The town was recognizable but changed, the way all small towns become recognizable but changed, the bones the same. The surface continuously rearranged by time and circumstance. At the First Methodist Choir, Rosalie's name was spoken every August at the morning service, closest to the anniversary. A small framed photo had hung in the choir room since 1987, placed there by the choir director who had known her. The director had retired in 2010. His replacement, a younger woman who had grown up in another county, kept the photo on the wall because she had been told it mattered, and she could see that it did. Detective Sergeant Karen Alves had been assigned Harwick County's cold case portfolio in 2018. She came to the Fitch file the way she came to all of them, reading every page, making her own notes, building a map of what had been pursued and what hadn't. What struck her about the Fitch file was how quickly the investigation had narrowed and then stopped. The alibi for Dennis Holt had been confirmed by 3 witnesses, and then never revisited. The tire tracks and boot print had been documented, but never matched to anything. There had been no canvass of the Holt property's immediate neighbors beyond the 2 farms directly adjacent. She requested the physical evidence from state archives in 2019. She submitted a funding application for forensic reprocessing in 2020, which was delayed by the pandemic and approved in 2022. By early 2023, the evidence was in the queue at a state forensics lab in Richmond. She was waiting on those results when the phone rang on a Tuesday night in March 2024. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If this kind of work matters to you, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Rosalie. The caller was a woman named Ruth Ann Sessler. She was 71 years old. She had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in January and given 4 to 6 months. She had grown up in Harwick County, had known the Holt family her whole life, and had worked a summer job on the Holt property as a teenager picking tobacco. She had left the county in 1989 and never moved back. She told Karen Alves that on the evening of August 21, 1986, she had been sitting in the cab of her then-boyfriend's truck at the far end of the Holt property's upper field. She and her boyfriend, a young man named Phil Garner, who had since died in 2011, had gone there to be alone. It was well past 10 o'clock, and she had watched Dennis Holt drive a tan car down the access road toward the tree line. She had watched him walk back out of the tree line alone 15 minutes later, get into his own truck, and drive toward the farmhouse. She had told Phil. Phil had told her not to say a word. She had believed, at 23 years old and new to keeping secrets that mattered, that staying quiet was the same as staying safe. She had kept the secret through Phil's death. She had kept it through her own marriage and her own children, and the slow passage of a life lived in Tennessee, away from Harwick County, away from the Holt name and everything it had carried in that community. She had kept it until she couldn't anymore. "I don't want to die with this," she told Alves. She had people who loved her. She deserved better than what I did. The forensic results from Richmond arrived 11 days after Ruth Ann Sessler's call. The boot print recovered from the access road in 1986, cast in plaster, preserved through 5 storage transfers over nearly 4 decades, had yielded a partial DNA profile from biological material trapped in the sole impression. The profile was incomplete, but it was sufficient for comparison. Dennis Holt, now 79 years old, was compelled to provide a DNA sample through a court order obtained on March 28, 2024. He complied. His attorney told reporters outside the Harwick County Courthouse that Mr. Holt had cooperated fully and had nothing to hide. The comparison came back 10 days later. The profile from the boot print was consistent with Dennis Holt. The probability of a random match was less than 1 in 340 million. Karen Alves drove to the Holt property on the morning of April 12th, with 2 deputies and an arrest warrant. It was a cool morning, the fields still carrying morning fog the way they do in that part of Virginia, before the sun gets high enough to burn it off. Dennis Holt came to the door of the farmhouse in the clothes he'd slept in. He looked at the warrant. He looked at Alves. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I knew this would come eventually." He said nothing further. He was transported to the Harwick County Detention Center, where he was processed and held without bond. The warrant listed the charge as first-degree murder. In Pemberton, the news moved the way news moves in a town of 4,000, person to person, within hours. At the assessor's office, a woman who had worked there for 20 years and had known Rosalie Fitch by reputation went home early that afternoon. She said later she needed to sit somewhere quiet. At First Methodist, the choir director who had inherited Rosalie's photograph looked at it for a long time when she heard. She sent a message to a friend. "I hope she knows." Warren Holt, 86 years old and living in the Roanoke facility, was not publicly implicated. The investigation into what he knew and when remains open. Loretta Fitch, 73 years old and still living in Waynesboro, received the call from Detective Alves on the morning of the arrest. She had been sitting at her kitchen table with her second cup of coffee. The photograph from the 1985 Christmas concert, Rosalie in the red dress, laughing, was where it had always been, on the mantel across the room. She said she sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after Alves hung up. She said she didn't cry. She said she just looked at the photograph and said her sister's name out loud. "I told her," Loretta said. "I told her they found him." Rosalie Fitch was 29 years old. She was saving money and making plans, and had just mailed a letter to her sister telling her that things were finally opening up. She had a voice the choir director called a gift and a stubbornness about her car, and a letter in the mail that arrived after she was already gone. She had a sister who drove to Pemberton every August for 38 years and placed flowers at the edge of a dirt road. She deserved better than what she got. She deserved better than what Ruth Ann Sessler chose for 23 years, and then, at the last possible hour, unchoose. But that unchoosing, made in a hospital room, in the shadow of a diagnosis, from a woman who finally decided that dying with the truth was worse than living with it, was what brought this case to an end. Dennis Holt awaits trial at the time of this recording. He has entered a not guilty plea. The proceedings are expected to begin in late 2025. What do you make of Ruth Ann Sessler's decision? 38 years of silence, then a phone call. Was that courage, or was it something else? And what do you believe happens in a small community where people choose, collectively, to protect one of their own at the cost of justice for someone else? Is that loyalty? Or is it something that should have a harder name? Leave your thoughts below. And if there's a case in your own state that you think has been protected the same way, we want to know about it. Justice found Rosalie Fitch after 38 years. The letter she mailed to her sister the week she died is still in Loretta's house. Stories like hers are why this work matters. If you believe truth is worth pursuing, no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Thank you for being here.